Awash ashore from Western Massachusetts, Bill Burke is a National Park Service employee who serves as the historian for the National Seashore. Bill's worked there for 30 years in several different roles. He assists researchers and educators by providing access to the park's collection of archives, historical photographs, and historical objects. The National Seashore itself, if you haven't been there, make it a point to go. It's a treasure trove of history, including homes, landscapes, and archaeological sites. Bill enjoys teaching very much, as well as learning from those who visit our small universe here on the Outer Cape. He holds a BA in History summa cum laude from Providence College and an MA in History and Historical Archeology from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Please join me in a warm welcome for Bill Burke.
Ah, thanks, that's great. That was impressive. I appreciate that introduction, and thank you to Eastham Historical Society, who are such great neighbors being across the street. So it's when they ask me to do a program, it's great. They have a beautiful meeting place, good crowds come in, and I just have to walk across the street. It's good. Okay, so tonight's topic is the creation of Cape Cod National Seashore. That's a handful. It's a very complicated story. We'll try to make it somewhat simple. So the plan tonight is I'm going to briefly tell the story of the creation of the park, simplify it down, but give you some little nuggets. We're going to have a few people read some quotes from what people on this part of Cape Cod felt about the proposed National Seashore, which are great quotes. I think you'll enjoy those. And then we'll talk about what was going on in 1961. For those of you who were around in 1961. We'll talk about the importance of baby boomers to the establishment of the National Seashore. So if you were born between 46 and 64. How many of you were born between 46 and 64? In a sense, this National Seashore and other national parks were created because of that demographic wave of the baby boomers. And then we're going to go into, I'll tell you a little bit about some source material if you want to dig deeper into that. And then we'll talk about the Cape Cod model. Because when this park was being proposed, the local population here was going to reject it. Absolutely. So there were compromises made and there was tweaks to the original vision of the National Seashore being created here. And there were 4 things that were thrown into the new mix, which we now call the Cape Cod model, to try to sell the idea of a National Seashore here. And it did work. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end about, well, how has it all gone? Is it successful? Are there problems? What about the vision from the 50s versus what it turned out to be and what it is in the future? And then I've got some images. We have time. We'll zip through those to kind of visualize what we're talking about. And then I would love to have a conversation with you all with questions, comments, because that's usually the best part of any program, I think, to hear what you have to think and say. Okay. So Albert Einstein once said, "A foolish faith in authority is the worst enemy of truth." A foolish faith in authority is the worst enemy of truth. So here I am, standing here. I am representing a federal bureaucracy, the largest employer in the world, with some type of authority. We've got the hat. And I work in the executive branch of government, Department of Interior, National Park Service. So we are an authority. But one of my good friends in high school, who was a rabble-rouser, and I was not a rabble-rouser, he said something like that quote, you know, you can't assume that the teacher, the principal, the priest, you know, they're all usually good people, but you have to find the truth. So what does that mean about the National Seashore? Well, when the National Seashore was proposed, there was a pushback against authority here on the Cape. The 6 outer Cape towns, which would be very affected by a federal bureaucracy coming in, there was distrust of the authority. And there was a distrust of the past record of the national parks in creating other parks, like Shenandoah National Park, Great Smokies, and Tetons, places where the national park went in and with a very heavy hand created a park and created a lot of discord, hard feelings, protest. And so the local community here was ready to push back and reject. I bet you probably thought I wouldn't be talking like this. Good. So I'm going to pass out a couple of quotes, and if you would be more than happy, hopefully loud voice, I'll tell you when to read it. Right. Who has a really big booming voice? No? Right there, don't be shy. Anybody? All right. So these are all quotes from the 1950s, either in newspaper editorials, at public meetings, people talking about this proposed Cape Cod National Seashore, which was going to be 43,000 acres. It was spread out over the 6 towns, Provincetown and Chatham. So let's hear what some of the people had to say in the community. These quotes took a little while to find, but they're pretty good. So why don't you, as loud as you can.
A native of Orleans said, "I've lived here all my life, and I would sure hate to see it overrun with campers and hot dog stands, which will happen if the park is foisted on us."
It's pretty cold. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. The proposal differs little from the movement, permanent displacement, and often annihilation of large populations in communist countries, with the attendant uprooting of home life at the arbitrary discretion of political leaders. The result may make the Cape Codders comparable to the Dalai Lama of Tibet. It's out to a new land by the aggression of the Chinese communists.
Big voice here.
The typical male native never goes to the beach except for clams, doesn't fish or sail, or take pleasure walks, and adores blacktop and chainsaws. If he gets any money, he takes off for his idea of paradise, which is a Florida motel, preferably in Daytona.
And who said that?
Kurt Vonnegut, 1961.
Who else has got a quote? Okay, go ahead.
Chester Crocker of Marston's Mills complained, "The proponents of this miserable proposition, through their almost total ignorance of the true state of affairs, now realize that most all of the outer beach is dangerous and unfit for swimming by the public."
So you're seeing some resentment and hostility. So the National Park Service had done studies going back into the 1930s, and the concern was that there weren't enough public beach access points in the country. They were very quickly, rapidly being privatized, people buying beachfront property, and so it was harder and harder for people, the American public, to get to a beach. So in the 1930s, the National Park Service, using Mellon Foundation money, did a study looking at coastal access. So already in place were the Yellowstone, Yosemite, other national parks, but mainly out west, big acreage parks. There was only one park east of the Mississippi by the 1930s, and that was Acadia National Park, at that time called Lafayette National Park. So the study found in the 1930s that only 7% of America's shorelines were accessible to the public. The study also went on to recommend 10 potential national seashore parks, so people could access a large stretch of beach. And out of the 10, Cape Cod was ranked #1 as the potential best place. The outer beach from Chatham to Provincetown had not really been developed yet. It was lightly developed. And we were within roughly 50% of the nation's population, if you consider driving from DC to here in a day. But we were within close range of the eastern seaboard, northeast corridor. So that's kind of where it sat in the 1930s. There was an early proposal to create a national seashore here that would run from Plymouth to Provincetown. And the estimate on the acreage cost was $10 an acre. This was in the depths of the Depression. So the National Park Service took that study and kept it, and then the Great War happened. But then after the Great War, Cape Hatteras National Seashore was established. And it was actually established before the Great War, and then funded in 1953. That is the first of eventually 10 national seashores that were created in the country. But Outer Cape Cod was at a crossroads in the late 50s. Population on Cape Cod was doubling every 10 years in the 50s. And so the Route 6 corridor was being built, the bridges had already been built in the 30s. So the baby boom population was coming, beach recreation was becoming very popular. You had motor vehicle access, you had post-war prosperity. So you have all of these demographic, economic, social things, and the National Park Service, to their credit, saw that coming, and they were desperately trying to create new national parks that could serve the American people who had more leisure time and wanted to recreate more. So that was the National Park vision for Cape Cod. They saw the wave coming. They had a relatively undeveloped stretch of 40 miles of beach. And so in 1956, the first proposals are delivered, and Cape Cod gets its first taste of a national seashore being proposed here. And over the next 5 years, there were public meetings, public hearings that were held. A big one was in Eastham in 1959. There's one in Chatham. And these hearings, the people at the hearings running it was either the Department of Interior Secretary, Senator Leverett Saltonstall, and Hastings Keith, who was the U.S. Congressman representing Cape Cod. And they had public hearings, and they wanted to hear what the people thought of the proposal. And you've heard the snippets of some of the hostile reactions. So what were the fears? So looking at it from the other side, not from the national park vantage point, but from the people living here in the 50s, what was the fear? What was troubling them? There were several. One was increased traffic. One was possibly a depreciation of property values. One was loss of future tax revenue, because you were now going to stop new building and construction, and towns would lose future tax revenue, potentially. In parks like Great Smokies, Grand Tetons, Shenandoah, the National Parks Service came in and evicted longtime mountain families and removed them from the new parks that were being created. So the biggest fear was that the local population thought if their house was in the proposed boundary of the new park, that house was going to be taken by eminent domain. And then what about, would the national park create official campgrounds that might put the local mom and pop campgrounds out of business? Was the National Seashore going to have their own gift shops and put out of business a bunch of other little stores? Would the National Seashore create National Seashore beaches? And what about the town beaches and the little revenue that the towns got? What was going to happen to all of these things economically? So, fear of losing your house, fear of losing your livelihood, fear of too much traffic. Those were those big fears. So, what do you do about that? Well, you get the people writing the legislation, and you engage them. And so Senator Saltonstall, Senator Kennedy, who was a senator at the time, Hastings Keith, they hired people like Fred Holborn, David Martin, and Jonathan Moore. These are legislative assistants who would help write and craft the legislation, would craft where the boundary of the park would be, and then they worked on how to make the compromises to make this thing happen. And that's what some of our images will try to show you as we go through. So the big issue was eminent domain. So within the proposed boundary of the National Seashore, there were well over 750 or so houses. Some were big and old from the 18th century. Some were camps and primitives built in the early 20th century. So what the National Park Service and the legislative assistants said, and they heard in the public hearings, we can't take houses by eminent domain. So if your house was here in the boundary before the legislation is proposed, those houses can stay. So today, within Cape Cod National Seashore, there's 660 private homes. These were built before September of '59. And those houses can remain in perpetuity and be bought and sold on the open market. Yeah. Not all the houses that were in the boundary could stay. And we could talk a lot about that at some point, and there were reasons for that, which we can get into. I'm sure you'll have questions about that. So that was the first concession. No taking of houses by eminent domain. So if your great-great-grandma built the house in 1850 and it's in the boundary of the park, say down in Nauset Roadways, that park could stay. They get a certificate of suspension of condemnation, which sounds really important, and it is. And that homeowner holds that certificate, and that house can be put on the market tomorrow and sold and passed down. And as long as the town is happy with how that property is being managed by the homeowner, like any other house in town with zoning authority. If you want to build an addition, you have to follow the town zoning restrictions. So that's one part of that Cape Cod model. Second part, what about traditional activities, surf casting, berry picking? Is that going to be allowed by the National Seashore? Can you go and hunt in the new National Seashore? Can you berry pick and take edibles out of the park? Can you fish and take fish out of the park? Can you go in and shoot a deer in the park and take it out during hunting season? It was loud and clear those activities had to continue. So within the legislation that is allowed. So today, the national park rangers that are out law enforcing, we follow state guidelines for hunting and fishing. So you need a state license to do those things. So these were concessions that, you go to other national parks, if you go to Yellowstone and pull out your rifle and take down a buffalo, you're in trouble. So that was a concession, traditional uses. But traditional uses is a pretty broad term, so we'll talk about that. And then another concession, or something that was debated, well, do the people have a direct voice to the superintendent who runs the park? It seemed like it was kind of this monolithic management of the park, manager of the park, and then the people in the neighborhoods living either in the boundary or out of the boundary. Can't there be a voice that people can get to the superintendent and get them talking and get them listening? So an advisory commission was formed, the Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission. And it was the first of its kind in the national park system. And I don't think the National Park Service really wanted to do this. But it was legislatively established that people would be appointed from each of the 6 Outer Cape towns. There'd be an alternate from the 6 Outer Cape towns. There'd be a state representative, a county representative, a secretary of interior designee, and they'd all sit and they'd meet 4 to 6 times a year. And they would advise, and the superintendent would be there, and they advise the superintendent. This is what's on our mind. So for example, one issue that came up was jet skis many years ago. Another issue was the nude sunbathing issue in Truro. And the subcommittee, the advisory commission, had a voice to the superintendent and said, what are you doing? Why are we doing that? Are we allowing jet skis? And they were representing the people of the communities here. So that was another part of that Cape Cod model. So suspending eminent domain, allowing traditional uses, advisory commission. Then the last piece to the Cape Cod model to make this park work was that you were going to need federal dollars to acquire land to create the park. Now, this is hard to believe, but up to 1961, that had never been done before. So when Yellowstone was established, that was already owned by the military. It was a transfer. When the Virgin Islands became a national park, when Acadia became a national park, when Great Smoky Mountains and the Tetons, these were all donations either from the Rockefellers or the Mellon Foundation, or the states would chip in, or there were actually public service drives by citizens to raise money for funds to create those parks. But in 1961, first ever national park, there was federal appropriated money. It started as $40 million, and then more money came over the decades to acquire land. And over the time, the first 25 years of the National Seashore, over 2,500 land transactions took place to create this patchwork of Cape Cod National Seashore. So today, there's 4% of the park is privately owned, those houses we talked about. 30% is either owned by Barnstable County or the state of Massachusetts or some of the towns. And those, again, make up 30% of the total 43,000 acres of the National Seashore. So it's not this big monolithic national park, it is a patchwork of all those entities owning land. Because the National Park Service didn't want to take Newcomb Hollow Beach and make it a federal beach. They wanted the town to be able to continue using it as a town beach. So those are some of the tweaks that had to happen for the big National Park Service to arrive here and to try to get approval from the population of the people who lived here. So obviously the people who were most agitated about the proposal were real estate developers, lumber yards. These were commercial concerns about we're not going to be able to build any new houses in this whole big chunk of the Outer Cape. So, you know, those people lined up against the conservationists, the people who saw this as the last chance to take 43,000 acres out of development and try to create a Cape Cod National Seashore. Questions so far? Yes.
Is Newcomb Hollow, so that part about the beaches still being town beaches, I should know, but I don't, sorry. Is Newcomb Hollow a town beach?
Yes.
And so is it, I'm sorry for dumbest question ever, is it part of the National Seashore and it just?
It's within the boundary of the park. But within the boundary, the town owns that swath of land with the parking lot and the beaches.
Okay, so is that part of the 4% private?
30% owned by some municipality.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Why is it the Coast Guard and also Light Beach are the federal, the Park Service beaches with Park Service guards? Or is Orleans, Wellfleet, Truro have town beaches? These things are not town beaches.
You asked for questions.
Well, the good folks of Eastham deeded the Vanasselite Beach and Coast Guard Beach to the National Park Service with the stipulation that citizens from Eastham, taxpayers, can get in for free.
Oh, that's the parking, the $25 it's service.
Yeah.
So Eastham kind of did it differently. And I'm assuming they probably just were sick of managing what they had, but as long as their citizens could get in for free, let somebody else take care of it. Yeah.
Did the towns decide which beaches they would keep and which they would turn over? Like, whose decision that Eastham gave all their beaches and?
The town fathers or mothers, select board, voters, they made that decision. And
Each town individually said?
Wellfleet said, no, we're hanging on to our stuff.
Okay.
So did Truro. So you go to Longwood Beach and Truro, town owned. Provincetown's different because poor Provincetown, 90% of their land mass was already owned by the state. And the state deeded those lands to the National Seashore, or National Park Service. So they didn't really have a say.
So what if Wellfleet all of a sudden said, we'd like to give it to the National Seashore? Would the National Seashore take it over?
I don't know. Probably. I tell you, we're in a holding pattern. Like at the first 25 years of the park, there were realtors who were employed by the park, who worked at park headquarters, and that's all they did for the first 25 years is they looked up every 2,500 parcels, and if you didn't have a house that was built before 59, that was going to be taken by eminent domain, and so they were sorting out 2,500 parcels, and but now it's different. In the last 25 years, the park is really in not much of a mood to acquire new land. It's very hard to get the congressional approval to do that. And in my years here, I think there's only been a couple of there's been some land swaps with towns, but there's only been a couple of real acquisitions where the park had to get legislative money to buy. So I think in that case, I think the park would be like, maybe not. Can't you keep doing it yourself? It's a different mentality now than it was. Yes.
There's a house on Cable Road that hadn't just built a house next to it within the last few years. How could that second home have been built?
All right, now we're getting in the weeds a little bit. Some houses, so when we went house by house, if a house had in excess of 3 acres, the National Park Service would acquire the excess land that you have. Say you own 50 acres. They'd let you keep your house and 3 acres around it, and by eminent domain, but with fair market value, you'd sell the rest. Some of the houses had some type of things in their deeds where they could build an ancillary structure. That might be the case, but I'm not the land person in the park, I'm the historian. So something was in the deed or some agreement where those people were sitting on a developable piece still.
So the government took the property by eminent domain, but at market value. What was the average price per acre back then?
I'm not sure, but it was a lot less than it is now.
It was what?
Yeah. So for example, the Richardson family, very prominent Eastham family. They owned all the land where the visitor center is and all the way around the crescent of Nauset Marsh. And they sold, but they still own their houses there, and I'm somewhat friendly with them. Elliot Richardson is the most biggest name. Still, the lineage goes back to that property. But all the other property was sold to the National Park Service at fair market value at that time.
Bill, one of the most interesting decisions that was made, and I'm referring to the Greatest Beach book, which is a great book. People want to really dig into the history of the seashore. Originally, the park was going to be just the beach. And at some point, the decision was made to go upland, right? Tell us about that decision and why that was made.
All right, so Bob mentions the Greatest Beach. It's a book by a UMass professor, Ethan Carr, and we collaborated with him. He wrote basically pretty much everything I'm saying tonight, although I'm smarter than he is. But yeah, the boundary, the whole concept of beach access, remember at the beginning we talked about the lack of beach access. and the National Park Service fixating on that. But then after a couple of years of looking at the map and where the boundary would be, they're like, you know, there's some pretty delicate ecosystems, somewhat regionally rare ecosystems, and so the boundary then was created that crossed the Cape in the Wellfleet area, included all of Great Island. So yeah, it was, I won't say it was mission creep, but you know, there was also a desire to have a beach on the bayside, warmer water, safer for kids. So there's a lot of thinking going on about starting with that beach access outer beach, which is darn cold and kind of rough, and then expanding it to other areas. So it took a while. You know. And then a lot of Chatham is going to be included in the boundary. Most of that came out. Morris Island, Monomoy, what's that other beach in Chatham, right near Morris Island. That was all taken out. It was in the original, and then they pulled it.
Yeah, North Beach.
Was that because Chatham wanted out?
Chatham was a very powerful lobby town, and they really pushed to keep the federal government out as much as possible. So today in the boundary is just an outer beach strip, and that's really about it. And they've already kind of surrendered Monomoy to Fish and Wildlife Service, which is also federal. That was back earlier in the 50s. And that's a whole interesting story too. Yes, Eileen?
The Captain Eminent House, that was not part of the original acquisition, correct?
Yeah, so in the earliest of years, the National Seashore was more focused on recreation and beaches and parking lots and visitor centers and bathhouses. But also in the original propaganda or brochures that were given out to the local townspeople, they did identify, hey, there's some pilgrim sites here. There's the colonial period Atwood Higgins House. So we can, as part of the National Seashore, include some of these crown jewels of history. And the Penman House early on was pointed to, Fort Hill was all within the boundary. So they approached the Penman family. The Penmans, the descendants of the Penmans sold that house to the National Seashore very willingly. Because just the niece was left. She really wasn't living in it. So the Park Service acquired it, I think, for about $20,000. The family said, for a little bit more, we'll give you everything in the house.
Oh, my goodness.
The gorgeous chandeliers, the bearskin rugs, don't get me started. And the park said, no. Just saving the house. We got a lot of other things on our plate. So to this day, we're trying to furnish it, but it's hard because everything went 12 directions. Yeah.
Well, you talked about eminent domain and taking the properties, but we're also like life estates where people worked with the Park Service and had a certain period of time that they kept their house and had to revert to the Park Service?
Yes. So, the park was created officially August 7th, 1961. When Kennedy signed the bill, within the bill, it said that any house built before September 15th, 1959 was safe. September 5th, 1959, the date that the legislation was first introduced in Congress. But when word got out that there was going to be a National Seashore, a whole bunch of people who were holding on to those quarter-acre lots or whatever, there was a mini building boom really fast. 59, 60, 61, right up until August 7th. So years later, as those realtors in the Park Service are going to each one of these tracks, they're looking at, this was built in 1960. You have to sell to the government. You missed the cutoff date. So, the people who built the house in 1960 had to sell to the government. Government gives them fair market value, with the option of lease back. So you sold it. It's not yours anymore. We will let you stay in that house for up to 25 years, and for every year you get to live in it beyond now, we'll take a % off the price that you're getting paid. So if you take the 25-year lease back, You get the fair market value of the house minus 25%. You don't own the house anymore. You get to live in it for 25 years. At the end of 25 years, you walk away. The government already owns it. You got your use of it. You know, this is hard. You know, if it was me and I quickly built the house, because people didn't know if this park was going to. I have letters in the archives from homeowners who are asking their congressman, is this park happening? Because I got a piece of land and I'm ready to build, and it's 1960. I got those letters, and these people are really worried, but they took a chance. They build the house in 1960, the legislation signed, the park happens, there's a retroactive date to 59. They eventually get caught up in the real estate transactions, and they have to sell. Some people just got the money, that was it, the park took it, maybe used for employee housing, maybe tore it down. We still have houses sitting in the park of this vintage. Some people took the 25 years. And then we got a lot of bad press when those people had to leave after 25 years. The park is taking my house. This is very frustrating, working at this park. It's the most frustrating thing, is misinformation. The people had already sold, they had 25 years in the house, and they knew for 25 years they were walking away. And they had the money. But then when they were leaving, it got ugly. This is in the mid-90s. So that's probably too much of what we want to hear. But,
No, what happened? Like there was a 99-year lease.
so let's just set the scene. We're going to run through the slides. So what was happening in 1961? Minimum wage, $1.15 an hour. Construction of the Berlin Wall was completed. Bay of Pigs Landing in Cuba is a disaster. Median family income is $5,700. Alan Shepard makes the first U.S. manned spaceflight. Kennedy signs an order establishing the Peace Corps. Harry Mason is the most popular show on television. I love that show. Candid Camera was number 2. Movie ticket was $1. Tuition at Harvard was $1,200 a year. Gas was 27 cents a gallon. Stamps were 4 cents. So you kind of get the picture of that, right? So let's go back in time. Before we do that, a couple other, besides the greatest beach, I have an electronic version. Dr. Carr's going to kill me when I say this. I have an electronic version with no photos. I can send that to you if you want the text. The Cape Cod National Seashore Landmark Alliance, out of print, Charles H.W. Foster. This is a story about the Advisory Commission, the first 20 years, and all the stuff that they were worried about the National Seashore doing. Birth of Cape Cod National Seashore, Francis Burling, he was editor at the Cape Codder, and the Cape Codder was a big, important newspaper on the Outer Cape that supported the concept of the park. So those are some of the source material. Okay. Here's another quote to start off. That theme we were talking about. At first when you read the quote, you're like, okay, the Reverend is going to go to one of these meetings and he's going to pound his fist and say, we need this National Seashore. But actually he was arguing the exact point, which was, we have to push back against the big bad federal government. So that's one of the most profound quotes that I could find. Okay, keep going. Yeah, so you may not be able to see this political cartoon, obviously from the Cape Codder. Is it going to be the National Eyesore or the National Seashore? I mean, what's so bad about Dairy Queen? I like Dairy Queen.
That's great.
So these are all newspaper headlines from the 60s. This is when, this is about a year before the law was signed to create the park. And there was a lot of problems with the legislation, a lot of pushback, and it was really fading. But this is right around the time that Senator Kennedy is becoming President Kennedy, and I think that ultimately kind of pushed things over the hump a little bit. again, danger of defeat, House floor. The House of Representatives was just not wanting to fund this thing. So just trying to build the concept that it was kind of close. And I wouldn't be standing here because I'd be working somewhere else. So the National Seashore proposal, this was from the brochure that was put out to the towns. So a lot of land in Provincetown, because that was mainly state land. 90% of Provincetown is basically now part of Cape Cod National Seashore. Truro, I think it's about 73% of Truro is National Seashore, at least in the boundary. There's private homes within the land. Wellfleet goes from ocean to bay, like we talked about. Down to Eastham starts getting skinnier, and then by the time you get to Orleans, so Orleans had already purchased land, 70 acres of land to create Nauset Beach. This is in the 50s, long before this. They didn't want any part of this National Seashore. So today, the town-run beach with their own vehicle program, and it's a fascinating coexistence that we have with them. And then Chatham basically gave a few crumbs. Harding's Beach, right, Morris Island, and of course, this was already a wildlife refuge monument. So I can say that most people who work in the park have never been to the little Chatham part of the park because it's really hard to get to. Okay, go ahead. So it's hard to imagine, but Cape Cod in the 30s and earlier was kind of the outer beach, and the outer part of the Cape was really the Wild West. You could kind of go out and camp anywhere. No one was really paying attention. And not too many people were coming to do that anyway. So I became good friends with this family who gave me these photos. And this family came to Cahoon Hollow with their vehicle. They lived in New Jersey, and they came up and they would camp just north of Cahoon Hollow. And there's the Hindenburg blimp right in the camera. Go ahead. So they'd show up at the beach. They'd make friends with the Coast Guard because the Coast Guard station was where, you know, the beachcombers, and they'd give the guy a few packs of cigarettes. He'd get the tractor off from the Coast Guard station, and he'd hold the vehicle up the steep hill, and so they could set up their camp. I mean, would any of this be able to happen today? And then the kids would hang out, and they'd go down to Orleans, they'd get the ducks from the duck farm, and they'd have a pet for the summer, and that was that. Boy, that's nice. And now look at us. Go ahead. So yeah, we talked about baby boomers. The Park Service is seeing a demographic wave. We need new national parks. So there was a whole big building and construction program starting in 1956. Cape Cod is within a day's drive of a whole bunch of people on the eastern seaboard. So this is all kind of the sales pitch that was being made. You know, Ocean City, Maryland, kind of gets caught up in development early. This is before Cape Cod National Seashore. You know, is that good? Is that bad? Is it everyone loves something, you know, but a lot of people didn't want, the Park Service didn't want to see the entire nation's coastline looking like that. Yeah. Okay, so in 1960, there were a lot of developments happening. You can get a half acre in Truro for about $500. At Fort Hill, there were Fort Hill estates that were all staked out. This is right before the establishment of the park. And there were going to be 33 houses, pretty big size. They'd all have little docks or access to docks. And they built an entry road into the estates that ended at the top of the bluff. That's where the little parking lot at the top of Fort Hill parking lot is. That was all carved out by the developer. But then at the last minute, the legislators are in a helicopter ride. They see the stakes on the ground. Someone says, yeah, that's beautiful open country by the water, and you got to save it. So they moved the boundary and included Fort Hill. They also switched things up. The park was going to own Hemingway Landing in Eastham. But then at the last minute, the park moved off of that, and that's a town landing now. But the Park Service built the restroom on that side of Fort Hill. So, you know, these little things are really interesting. So we have this main public restroom for the entrance to Fort Hill, but then we pulled back the boundary and it's a town thing. Anyway, I find it I'm a geek on it. It's very interesting. So Eastham, you know, I threw some slides in, early Eastham. So the town hall was built in 1912, you know, so open landscape, dirt roads, you know, so Eastham of the 1959 era when this was being debated was a lot different. Right? This was roughly the Coast Guard beach area. There were some houses out there, but it was still pretty wild. And then it got developed a little bit later, more houses closer to the water. Because remember, the old timers didn't want to live near the water. There's too much wind and storm, and you got to live in the hollows, and so that's why the outer beach was never really developed. It's really inhospitable until you can really winter, you know, you got a fancier house and stuff. So the Coast Guard's beach was built. The Vanasselite beach area was eventually developed by the town. So, you know, Vanasselite is here before it got moved back to about here. This is the house that's kind of at the big intersection now. So the parking lot's about here now. This is all gone. Here's the center beacon of the Three Sisters, the French cable hut. And this was the little hot dog stand. And, yeah. Bob's dog house. So the town ceded all this to the National Seashore. So you had the Lighthouse that was moved there in 1923, replacing the Three Sisters. And then the Three Sisters themselves have been kind of broken apart. Two of them was made into that studio, and then the third one was part of that little store. And then the Park Service eventually acquires them all and reassembles them. It's kind of a cool story.
Susan Abbott was here last week.
And you know, there are other park buildings that became part of the park. The Salt Pond House is right near Salt Pond Visitor Center, just right off Route 6 by the town landing. There was a hotel that was developed there. All of that was eventually acquired by the park and torn down. Used for employee housing for a while. So, Park Service, preserving traditional uses. Go ahead. You've got Senator Saltonstall on the left there, touring the Cape with legislative aides and other politicians. You had the Eastham Town Hall hearings in December of '59. So here's Senator Saltonstall, got Hastings Keith, and we've got some of the town administrators. And it was a really cool meaning, not favorable reception. A lot of those comments we started with at the beginning came out of that hearing. But when all was said and done, Kennedy, who's now president, signs the bill into law in 1961. And that, from that day forward, hopefully all these compromises that were patched together to make good with the local population, hopefully, and the whole blueprint is in the legislation, and hopefully it's going to work. First park staff, this is the entire staff, first year 62. So today we have 130 seasonal employees and about 70 year-round employees. First superintendent, Robert Gibbs, he was superintendent at Cape Hatteras, very controversial, hard park to work at. They sent him here to deal with it here. Here's one of the realtor specialists, and they basically have one park ranger.
Where does that house, the building?
This is the Nauset Coast Guard Station at Coast Guard Beach. This was the first park headquarters, was down at the Coast Guard Beach. And Bev Farrell, who was one of the early administrative assistants, I actually worked with her when I first came here. That makes me feel really old. Remember we talked about the advisory commission. This was going to be kind of the, if you will, the police, the people who would talk to the superintendent, give them opinions. So this was the very first meeting in the basement of Nauset Coast Guard Station at Coast Guard Beach. And most of those people are smoking cigars. And the only woman, Esther Wiles of Wellfleet, was a completely outspoken opponent of the park in the 50s. And Wellfleet said, you know what, you're going on the advisory commission because you're well versed in what's potentially going to happen that's wrong. Okay. So there was some early developments that never really happened, which I find fascinating. So there was going to be a nature trail at Freshbrook Village in South Wellfleet. The advisory commission saw the plans, they said, no, you're not doing this. In the legislation it says, thou shalt not create in undeveloped pristine areas park facilities unless absolutely necessary. So the park had started a boardwalk, park took the boardwalk out, no trails there today, but a great place to walk your dog or what have you. Okay. First visitor center right before the Rotary on the right. There's still a flat area there. There's that lonely ranger giving out brochures that probably said something to the effect, it's all going to happen soon, we're getting beaches. Go ahead. Early lifeguard uniforms, go ahead. Mounted patrol, that went on until the early 80s. Outermost House, here's the whole Outermost House collection that the Historical Society has, some of the materials. That was on Coast Guard Beach, that gets destroyed in the storm of 78. This is the designation, the governor of Massachusetts, Henry Beston, designating that as a national literary landmark. But alas, it's all gone now. The National Park Service says, oh, the north side of Salt Pond. This is what the north side of Salt Pond looks like back probably in the 30s. And that visitor center was going to basically be plunked probably around here. But during the 40s and 50s, there was a golf course that was built in and around the area. So our visitor center is here, Eastham Historical Society is here, and there was an 18-hole private golf course that was developed, and today you can, when you're out in the woods, you'll see, the old sand bunkers, and it's pretty cool. There's a program, is it next week?
Yes.
Next week about?
2 weeks.
2
No,
weeks.
3, no, the 31st.
Yeah. So really cool stories. Okay, there's the visitor center being built. The car that I always wanted, never got. And the opening ceremony when the visitor center was first built, that's Senator Saltonstall on the right. That's a young Ted Kennedy in the middle, and that's Stanley Joseph, the second superintendent, walking up the pathway to do the dedication ceremony at Salt Pond. There's the classic Ranger wave. The Provincetown bike trail, which was the first bike trail ever built by the National Park Service. There's the other visitor center. There was going to be 3 visitor centers, but they eventually nixed one. One was going to be at Great Island, and it was going to have some kind of aquarium or something, but that was eliminated. But the second visitor center, using the hexagonal architectural motif, there's whole books about that, we won't get into that. Go ahead. So the National Seashore, this is a very interesting time in American history, late 60s, early 70s. We thought we'd be good at hosting rock concerts. I don't think so. So this one got a little out of hand, and there were fires set, and they tried to burn down the visitor center.
What band did you
I have the bands listed in my archive, but I don't think you'd recognize anyone. And there was a small group of a chapter of the Hells Angels that also showed up.
Naturally.
There's a couple newspaper articles about that concert. The early female uniforms. We did the life-saving demonstration down at Coast Guard Beach. Go ahead. Shipwrecks. That's why I'm employed by the park. I'm the Cultural Resource Program Manager. I'm keeping track of the archaeology, the shipwrecks, the museum collection, everything else. One of the best headlines I've ever seen. So there was a nude beach that really got popular just south of Hampton Beach in Truro. And, that eventually got settled. That was a little rocky. Off-road vehicles. So I think out of if you had to list the 5 hottest topics of the National Seashore in terms of controversy and people not agreeing, off-road vehicles definitely. Go ahead. Because in the early days of the park, people could drive just about anywhere they wanted in the dunes, especially in Provincetown and Truro. You could drive from Race Point all the way to Coast Guard Beach in Eastham, right on the Outer Beach. Very little regulation. But then the park was sued by the Conservation Law Foundation, and we had to come up with an off-road vehicle plan. So sometimes we're seen as the conservation champion, but then other years we're seen as the people kind of too lax about the conservation. So we get sued from different sides. So we allowed the sand dune tour vehicles to continue. That business had been operating long before the park. We had a commercially mined sand pit right on the Truro Provincetown line. We had a parking lot there. People could go up and slide down. But then it got a little out of hand, much like that concert. Not as dramatic. And we closed that area down in the early 80s, too much resource damage. We're moving some historic structures. This is when the park is starting to get more keen about history and not just beach recreation. So we're saving buildings. This was in Chatham, across from the Chatham Fish Pier. Park sort of saved it, moved it to Race Point. Bathhouse at Coast Guard Beach. But we know, most of us know what happened, right? Storm 78 takes that whole thing out. That was a lesson learned. Don't make beach parking lots too close to the ocean. But sometimes we still make that mistake. Okay. Lifeguard uniforms. Dune shacks. We're going to roll through this because I know there'll be a question about dune shacks. A marvelous, absolutely one-of-a-kind resource in the park. A lot of these shacks were just used by people who want to get away from authority. A lot of these shacks were used by artists and creative types. That's Boris Morgan. We've got great archaeology finds in Eastham, right down the road. And we've had modernist architects like Serge Tremaev and Marcel Breuer who built houses here. And now the park owns 11 modernist period houses that are significant. Here's one of the ones that we own that the Cape Cod Modern House Trust manages. Park is really much more involved with ecosystem restoration, restoring the 1,500 acres of the Heron River Estuary is going on. We try to keep vistas clear through burning and mowing. We get a lot of new inlets and new beaches and changes in beach formation. You're looking south from Orleans towards Chatham. That was a new inlet in 07. And one of the funniest quotes I've ever heard was, we're standing there, some of the people in the park drove down with Graham Geis, who's the coastal geologist, emeritus, and it was just this little opening at the time, and we're like, so what's going to happen here? Is it going to get bigger? And sorry, Graham, he said, oh, that's going to seal up, no problem. So that channel is still there, and much bigger. I find humor in things like that. North Beach cottages, these again were cottages where the ownership was very shaky. We don't have time to really get into that at the moment. Those had to be removed. That beach was eroding like 70 feet a year. And then one of the last acquisitions the park did pull together was the Baker Biddle property. It's an historic house, a cluster of historic houses in Wellfleet on Bombrook Island, and that was acquired about 10 years ago, because it was going to be redeveloped into multiple houses. And so the house, the big house on Great Island, or as you're getting towards Great Island, this is one of the things that the founding people of the park never realized. But so you had these private properties in the park, 660 private inholders, but no one ever envisioned that people of wealth could come in, buy it with cash, tear it down, and then redevelop it into something much bigger. That was a foreign concept in the 50s. Because most people couldn't do that, and they'd get a mortgage, and then, you know, it was different. But this is considered, from our point of view, to be an issue because you're changing some of the visual character in parts of the park. But private houses in the boundary, we have no zoning authority at the Cape Cod National Seashore. The zoning authority lies with the towns. And we have some guidelines we hope people follow, but a person who redevelops a little cottage into something big, if they can get it through Wellfleet zoning, they're fine. We tried to sue them once, it didn't work. So we've learned. But that was one of the concessions. The park would not have zoning authority over the inholders in the park. But, you know, a lot has changed in the last 60 plus years of the park, but one thing that I think we're making progress with is relationships with the two federally recognized tribes that held the ground here that we're on today, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the Gayahead tribe. And so we try to have joint festivals, education programs, and right now we have some Native interns who are working in the park, doing programs and research for us. And to wrap this up, the Berkshire Eagle from Western Massachusetts published this right before the signing, saying the creation of this park was the finest victory ever recorded for the cause of conservation in New England. Okay, and that concludes my thoughts. This topic is very near and dear to me. I've worked here a long time. I take it very seriously. I see what's written in the paper sometimes. I hear misinformation. So I think it's important for me and others to make sure that the people on the park staff and the general public at large get to interface with National Park employees and get a chance to hear what we have to say and then to hear what you have to say. I take that very seriously because we can be a bureaucracy that shrinks from interaction, and that's troubling. So a small way of getting that going again was to do this program tonight. So thank you all for listening, and have a great night, everybody. Right?